Hey everybody, John Malanka here with casual conversations with the board from the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, Dr. Jordan Tishler, Dr. Adam Abodili, and Dr. Jehan Marcoux. Good to see you guys again, as always. Topic this week, mood disorders. And I know mood disorders may or may not affect the four of us on the call here, but it does affect many Americans as well as citizens of the world, especially what we're going through here during this COVID era that we're experiencing, I guess. So welcome, guys. Let's talk about mood disorders and incorporating cannabis and how cannabis and the endocannabinoid system can help with some of these mood disorders. Who would like to start today? Well, let's go with the leader of our group, Dr. Jordan Tishler. How about that?
All right, thank you. One of the things I want to start with here is let's talk about what do we mean by mood disorders, right? Generally speaking, mood disorders are thought to include unipolar depression, right? And anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder. And then there are many, many subdivisions and refinements of that, but those are, I think, some pretty good ways of thinking about it. And then there are some other illnesses like bipolar disorder, which also are mood-oriented disorders, right? There's depression as well as mania, which is sort of the uncontrolled, exuberant opposite of depression. But it's also worth knowing that, or noting that in bipolar disorder, particularly those who experience mania, there is sort of potential for a transition from just sort of this exuberant mood into something where you get kind of more of that psychotic thought disorder. And so that's one which is kind of a little bit separate from, though related to, kind of what we think of as the standard mood disorders.
I'm interested in, when we look at mood disorders specifically, and with my experience, that comes on the oncology side predominantly. And, we're in an interesting situation here in New York in the sense that, cancer is one of these approved diagnoses but at the same time, you have to list associated symptoms that come along with it. And so one of them is, of course, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, which is fine. However, it's, putting this diagnosis on it. Not everybody with cancer has chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. However, a lot of patients come to my office, of course, because they want to use cannabis, and it's clearly, with their cancer diagnosis. And there is no doubt it is much more of to treat the general anxiety and the depression, the lack of sleep that goes along with this diagnosis. Not about treating the cancer, but just treating their, their mental health and their well-being with cannabis. And and of course we know, the data on that is, of course there's opposing, views to, treating for anxiety and depression, but the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that when patients say it helps them sleep better, and, of course it is not for everybody, you're absolutely right. And it's probably about a 75% to 25% mix of my patients who, meaning 75% have already used cannabis. They're not first time users, and about 25% are completely newbies. So they have a general understanding of how it's, going to work for them, or they have this notion, they've tried it before, they didn't have any negative side effects. So those are the people that, they're less likely to have, a negative, experience from it. Of that, 25 other remaining 25%, we do see people that, it doesn't agree with them. They don't like the way it makes them feel. They don't like the side effects. They, from a cancer standpoint, from a mood disorder, I mean, I feel blessed that I've never been, diagnosed with that, but, I could only imagine, and we witness every day, how people react emotionally differently to the, to that diagnosis. And none of it's not hard to understand why it'd be a very challenging thing to have to deal with. And cannabis does provide some significant help for the mood disorders that are associated with with that diagnosis. And when we talk about mood disorders too, I also kind of think about just, general symptoms, when we talk about, we're talking about, trying to lump these mood disorders into, depression, anxiety or some of these other things, but also just, the general, quality of life and, how people perceive their, their well-being and their happiness and things of such, where again, I think cannabis provides, symptom relief, if you will, for a lot of this.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And, can you share with them that if the patient decides to go the route of chemoradiation, they can incorporate cannabis where it's not going to zero out, if they are going to go the conventional route, those modalities and the majority of other modalities when battling cancer. Can you just touch up on that, and then I'll move on to something else?
Yeah, that's a great point. The majority of cannabis consumers are practiced with that diagnosis are not looking for it as a treatment option or an alternative to chemotherapy. Yes, there's been we get an occasional individual that wants to take this very holistic approach to their health and wellness, and they refuse to use chemotherapy and they want to use it, and but that's not the majority. The majority are people that want to use it as an adjunct, and that again, that adjunct can be for multiple different reasons.
And they do, because a lot of doctors that will say, I prefer my patient not using cannabis when they're on this other treatment, chemoradiation, because we don't want anything affecting this. From your experience and you working with cancer patients, do you see that affecting the treatment if they do go the conventional route?
Only in the positive for
Okay.
their ability to get through, again, chemotherapy and radiation, and you combine the two, it's no fun for anybody to have to go through.
Okay.
No, I don't, and I guess I'm fortunate enough too that the oncology group that I work closely with is also very supportive.
I'm gonna ask Dr. Tishler a question, and I'll come back to you, Dr. Marcoux, in a second here. For the patients that live in legal states have access, or the patients that don't live in legal states have access, you being a recommending physician, what can you share with that to help with their disorders? Because still a lot of patients do not have legal safe access, which I'll lead to the safe part back to you, Jehan, in a second. Can you share what you can share with some of the patients that call you and saying, help, I live in this state, but we don't have legal access?
Thankfully, the vast majority of Americans now live where they do have legal access. That divides by population as opposed to sort of by state. But even Georgia and Alabama are in the process of working on their medical laws, and in fact have been in touch with the association for guidance. So that's a good thing. But overall, what I think is important is that, like I always say, cannabis is a medicine and probably shouldn't be used without some guidance by somebody who's, understands both cannabis and medicine. And a perfect example of that is that if you ask our cannabis advocate friends about how to treat anxiety and depression, you will universally get an answer that involves the wake and bake approach, which is to say that before your feet hit the floor in the morning, you smoke up a big bowl. And then throughout the day, if you feel any anxiety or whatever, you just keep smoking. And actually what we know is that that's a really bad approach, that there are a wide array of studies that show things like school and work performance degradation by high use THC dominant products throughout the day. We also have another group of studies that show that in fact at high doses, we can actually worsen anxiety and depression. And in fact, what we end up with is sort of a vicious cycle where people overuse cannabis and then they have more anxiety, more depression, so they use more cannabis. And that in fact pretty much guarantees that we're heading towards a cannabis use disorder. So a much more effective approach is a low dose of cannabis, meaning 5, 10, 15 milligrams at a time, given typically in the evening, right before bed, or maybe a little bit earlier, but in that kind of range in terms of dose and frequency. And the interesting thing about that, to me anyway, is that while that cannabis administered at that time will in fact cause some intoxication, as cannabis does, what's interesting is then that intoxication wears off overnight. And yet the benefit to the anxiety and depression persists throughout the next day. And what that tells me is that it's not the intoxication that's therapeutic. The intoxication is really a side effect, but that it is in fact a more direct and subtle effect of the cannabinoids on the neural architecture that is in fact affecting the mood disorder throughout the day when the intoxication has gone away. I think that our cannabis using friends tend to misassociate being stoned with not being anxious. And in fact, it's actually much more subtle than that. And the mechanism for that, I think, has yet to be investigated. Then again, let's remember that the mechanism by which the SSRIs work is still fairly much a theory. That is to say, we know how the chemistry works. We also know how the chemistry of cannabinoids work, but why that leads to less depression or less anxiety, I think in both cases remains quite unclear. So again, low doses given in the evening seem to be very salutary, whereas sort of high doses throughout the day, every day, really can backfire.
I'm someone who's really sensitive. I wouldn't look like a sensitive guy, but even don't let the shirt fool you. No, but even with, if I have a glass of wine, I have a glass of wine and I'm okay. I have buddies that have 3 bottles of wine and they're perfectly fine. But even with cannabis, there's days that I have high anxiety from work and whatever. And if I use cannabis at night, the next day I'm perfect then. And the next day, my anxiety is even higher the next day. And so you talking about, and it's not high doses, where a lot of people do have that. And so I have to, I do tinctures at night or gummies before bed. A lot of people don't really approve of that. Just for sugar content, I guess, because for some of these patients. But Jehan, I didn't see you in the dark over there, my friend. I didn't forget you. But with your studies, what have you seen? I know we're talking mood disorders, but we're staying on anxiety and depression, because I think those are 2 things that are really coming up quite a bit. And if you look into Google, those are the 2 top searches: it's anxiety, sleep, depression, those and pain over cancer. And I think because of COVID, that has overtaken the rankings on Google searches. With your studies, and I know you do a lot of studies, what are you seeing with patients and what they're finding success with anxiety and depression? And are they finding more success with instantaneous via smoking a cannabis joint, cigarette, or vaporization versus an edible and or a tincture? And so are you seeing in your studies any difference on bringing the anxiety and depression down?
Great questions, John. And as a basic and clinical researcher, my experience is a little bit different. I look at the data, not necessarily looking at the patient every day, but you're monitoring. Maybe you're doing something prospective or retrospective. And there's a couple of things that in my experience, it seems like cannabis is associated with mood disorders in a variety of ways, depending on factors if we discuss. I've also noticed that just discussing cannabis and mental health seems to induce a mood order in vulnerable individuals sometimes. And I think that's because, to the point you just made about how are people using this, over the last let's say 10 years, the changes in the cannabis space have been phenomenal. We've gone from 0 adult use places to a lot. There's been an explosion of regulated product diversity and even more, let's call them innovative products in the unregulated space. I just read an article in Vice, which I hear is like CNN these days, but they actually contacted some clandestine researchers who said the underground market is filled with products laced with synthetic drugs and synthetic cannabinoids. And I think that's really important, because as researchers are trying to suss out what's happened, remember, data sets, data pools that were collected that are being published today weren't gathered yesterday, maybe not even last year. Maybe they come from a database that ranges decades. And that's important because that means they're looking at a street drug. not a regulated product, not a specific product. They don't know how people are using these products, and they don't really know many of the other factors, or maybe they know some of the factors, age, socioeconomic status, and things like that. And I think that that is an important aspect, because when we look at, if we start at the top, at the most regulated products, you know, the nabiximols of the world, Sativex, Epidiolex, CBD, THC in the form of Marinol, or in the liquid preparation Syndros. These are all prescription drugs in many countries. We don't see the same abuse liability, the same association. Sativex or you know, nabiximols with a standardized extract of products simply aren't associated with significant like amounts of euphoria or alterations in mood. And that may seem counterintuitive until you think about what can affect mood. And if you're suffering from chronic pain, if you have severe multiple sclerosis that's so bad you lose control of your bladder and suddenly you can get that quality of life back, your mood may improve. And so we have to be careful and more precise in our terminology. Exactly as you said, John, what are people using? How are they using it? And what other factors are there? Their clinical diagnosis, their nutrition factors. You know, there's electronic health data, there's big data, and kind of taking that to come up with a more precise answer. No one is denying there are vulnerable individuals out there whose mood disorder may get worse from chronic cannabis use. But we're also saying that there are populations that might respond favorably to that. And I think that we have to kind of be careful and a little more specific about what we're talking about. And I've seen this in clinical research, you know, you want to be careful how you phrase it, because do you want to document it as euphoria or as an improvement of mood? What makes more sense if you're talking about chronic pain patients who stop using opioids and start using cannabis? Both of those products can cause euphoria and intoxication and impairment, but I think the context of that is really important. Are they feeling better because they can do more and they're having a better quality of life? And thinking about what the underlying symptoms are. Is it a recent trauma? Is it something neurological, a genetic issue? And I think those are important factors to consider when we try to look at the research, because when you try to talk to colleagues about cannabis is great for X or Y, there's always a big but in there somewhere, or there's always a way you want to look at the data, especially when you're talking about harms and risks and trying to balance them. And I think for most people, you have to remember that a lot of our information based on mood disorders in cannabis is population based. However, we have a lot of clinical work where measuring scores of mood and was just part of the panel of things they were asking people. And so we have some interesting leads from looking at things like pain studies and neurodegenerative conditions and seeing, oh, wow, there are improvements of mood scores, but those are not mood studies per se. So I think, yeah, as you said, that would be a great question for future population-based researchers, you know, epidemiologists and the such, to include that more specific questions about where are people getting these products and what type of preferred administration forms are they thinking in, and how much do they think they're using. You know, there's some promising advances, and I guess I'd leave with this, is if you want to read more, Dr. Cinnamon Bidwell has conducted a lot of interesting research in this area. Dr. Bidwell actually has money to have a van and will drive to cannabis users' house, and they will use whatever product, and then they can come into the van and have all sorts of physiological parameters measured outside their house. So sounds like a great way to make extra money. If you're a researcher,
or get in trouble jumping in,
or get in trouble. Yeah. So all your neighbors will know in the van with the giant weed leaf and medical equipment shows up what you're up to. But I think that is a really, I think that data that she's gathering with her team is going to be the type of data we actually need. There's so many diverse products out there. You can't just simply be, do you inhale cannabinoids? Because there's a half a dozen different ways to do that. And there's many different products, and you can't just say, oh, I'm use a hemp product and assume that someone's not getting intoxicated from that, because we now know that, you know, hemp gummies can have just as much THC in them as a regulated gummy under the 0.3% rule.
Sure. I have so many products that are sent to me, and there's some products that have that 0.3%, and I'll just take a hemp CBD dropper and I'm feeling it through the day. And so I can't afford to lose a day because of that. And so I just say, note to self, and even that's a whole other topic. And I know you do a great presentation on safety and what to look out for. So another discussion. Dr. Tishler, sleep. I'm a big fan of sleep and how important sleep is. And sometimes not having that sleep can lead into anxiety, can lead into a depression. So having that domino effect. And so when you're working with patients, do you ever start and say, let's fix this first? Because a lot of patients I'll talk to said, I went down to the dispensary and I came away with 5 to 6 different products to help my sleep, to help my anxiety, to help my eating, to help my what. I think it's important, if you take a look at this and the domino effect, you'd be surprised on what this one thing called sleep can do for anxiety and depression in most cases, not all cases.
Well,
and so do you ever start with that?
Well, actually, it's kind of ironic in the sense that, first of all, I was shaking my head because you're right. So often patients come even after I've spent an hour with them saying, this is what we're going to do, and this is the product you need. And I write it all down for them. And then they go to the dispensary. I mean, this is really my biggest pet peeve at the moment. And then the guy behind the counter says, dude, I don't understand your doctor. So just buy this and that and the other thing. And then they come back to me a few months later and they say, doc, it didn't do anything. I just got sick and really stoned. And I'm like, well, what did you do? Well, I did this, that, and the other thing that the guy at the store said. And I said, well, yeah, I could have told you none of those things were going to work or they were going to make you sick. How about the thing I suggested? Oh man, they didn't say that. I'm like, okay, why don't we now try that? Doc, it's great. I'm so much better. I'm like, so, that kind of derailment drives me bonkers. Yeah. But, to your question about sleep, absolutely. Sleep confounds everything, whether we're talking about mood disorders or we're talking about pain management. It all gets into a big bad state when sleep is poor. And of course, these things it's a two-way street, right? That your sleep makes your mood or your pain worse, and then your pain and your mood make your sleep worse. And so, yeah, getting in there with cannabis so that you can kind of right the ship makes a huge difference. And back to my point that generally when I'm starting to think about somebody with a mood disorder, I'm thinking about using this around bedtime anyway. So we kind of get double or triple duty out of this. And I think that's one of the areas where, of course, many physicians think, oh, this can't be real because it's doing so many different things. But in fact, if you understand the basis of the endocannabinoid system and the way that regulates across multiple primary effector systems, then it starts to make some sense why you're getting sort of multiple bangs for the buck, in the same way that all of those issues, pain, mood, sleep, are connected to each other symptomatically. It's also because those systems are connected to each other. So yes, getting in there with, a little bit of vaporized cannabis before bedtime can be wonderfully helpful for the mood disorder and also for sleep. And so you're kind of getting all of that in one fell swoop.
So if I could just add to what Dr. Tishler said, just some research I was looking through about sleep. What's interesting is that when patients first start using a cannabis product, and again, when it suffers from the population data issue, but when they're surveying people about this, there's an association that sleep improves using it, 2 or 3 days, but that if you're using it every day for sleep, the same amount, that sometimes the effects start to diminish. And so, I think one of the aspects too is sort of like time on, time off from using these products for sleep. I mean, and it's up to the individual as we get more precise with the treatment. And also to your point, Dr. Tishler, right? We're talking about there's all these interconnected parts of the brain. So you got the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, where you have a ton of cannabinoid receptors that are just itching to be stimulated by endocannabinoids or cannabinoids. And they're right in those areas that mirror, that pharmacology parallels their location. So yeah, okay, so things having to do with anxiety and fear, emotional processing. That's right where we find those things in that part of the brain. And again, this is one of the reasons we're even talking about this as a therapeutic, is because there are targets there and we can target them potentially, and we'll be more precise as we, again, understand the individual needs of a person. And, I would love to be able to do a clinical study where we could get a baseline of people, say, well, how active is their amygdala in the morning and at night? Are there some people who just like that anxiety and fear stuff just starts kicking on at night? And does cannabis, does this CBD rich product help to lower that activity or induce it, or is it a THC product? So again, I just wanted to throw that out there as, as the neuroscience on this becomes clear, I would love to see more data with like MRIs and fMRIs and patients using these products. And I think this brings up the issue that I'll just end with for the moment as I step off my hemp box is one thing that'd be really interesting for me is starting to actually track how the same individual responds to the same cannabinoid or cannabis preparation in the morning and at night, because there are receptor systems in our body that have different basal activities in the morning and at night, like the adenosine receptor signaling, like that's tends to change its activity. We have different endocannabinoids being expressed in the morning versus the night. We tend to have a lot of 2-AG, 2-arachidonyl glycerol circulating when we wake up, and that drops and an anandamide goes up and we get really hungry. And then after we eat, we get sleepy. And then this cycle of these endocannabinoids rising and falling continues. And so it would be interesting to start to track that more specifically when people are using these products.
A friend of mine, her daughter is autistic and a functioning autistic, but she goes to UCLA about 3 times a year and has an EEG. She has one coming up, and they keep her there for 24 hours. And I introduced cannabis to the family about 4 years ago, and they asked the doctors, may we do this minus the autistic medicine, just with cannabis? And we tried different cannabinoids. And so this next one, they just tried a whole new formulation, and she'd been off her Epidiolex. She did go Epidiolex because the doctors did want, there's no studies behind this, and there's, we need prescription medication. I said, Epidiolex. And they knew nothing about this. So they prescribed Epidiolex for her, and she's been up and down. And said, let's try something on a whole plant medicine. And so the last 2 EEGs have been successful. And so we're trying a new product they're trying a new product. Dr. Abdilis, earlier you talked about oncology and highs, and a lot of patients and a lot of doctors that we work with are afraid because they just think you take it and you're stoned, and that's what it is. And there are about 140 plus different cannabinoids, and each play a role, just as you were saying, Dr. Tishler. And I always say it's not like duct tape with 1,000,001 uses, but when you really dive deep into this, you'd be blown away on what it helps with sleep, anxiety, depression, cancer, etc. More is not always better. And the goal, which I always share, is the goal is not to be high. The goal is to be healed or become healthier or have relief. Can you share with your patients that come in and say, I want the medical stuff, I don't want the recreational stuff? And a lot of people consider CBD as medical, THC recreational, which I believe is not the case. I think they all play a part in bringing the body back to balance and healing, especially with cancer. My father-in-law had success with 3 to 5 milligrams in fighting his cancer, where others use 25 milligrams. And can you share that everyone's different, and the goal is not to be high and not to be fearful of that? I mean, because when you're going through that, the last thing you want to be is completely stoned out of your mind and worried and, nightmares, and for some, and being uncomfortable for many.
Yeah. Well, and kind of closing here, I'll say that, I do believe that, we know that everybody's endocannabinoid system is different. And that's what the challenges are here when it comes to, not only treating, mood disorders, but everything else, and also understanding, particular, side effects, and knowing that, again, going back to what Dr. Tishler is saying, where, once you educate somebody about the endocannabinoid system, then it starts to kind of make sense to people about why this is important. And that's one of the things we stress on our wellness side, as well, is understanding the endocannabinoid system, understanding not just that what cannabis can do for endocannabinoid system, but how else can you potentially keep your endocannabinoid system healthy. And I am, I have to believe that some of the reason why cannabis works for people and may not necessarily work in larger studies is because of the genetic, variability that, that we have, that individuals have. And so again, it's not for everybody, but people do react, differently. And I look forward to seeing this, kind of expand with regards to our understanding of how the endocannabinoid system actually works, but our ability, our individual targets, how are they different? We know that we have animal studies as well as human studies that show that people with depression have different levels of endocannabinoids, as well as even things like the enzymes which are responsible for breaking down our natural endocannabinoids. So and sometimes people just need might just need a little boost to their endocannabinoid system. Cannabis is one of the options that can assist in that, but there's other things, exercise, eating healthy, sleep, which you talked about. All these things are important to the health of our endocannabinoid system too. So again, going back to the whole thing, it's not for everybody, but in my world of cannabis, there are the two populations. There are the people for that are using it for things like cancer and inflammatory bowel disease, and the people that are incorporating into their health and wellness routine the same way they're incorporating, yoga or any other, supplement.
It's a never ending battle for sleep, anxiety, depression, health, everything. So, but I thank you all. Dr. Tishler, how can your fellow medical professionals who are watching find you, join the organization, Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and the benefits of doing this? I believe education is key, especially in all industries, but this industry, throwing that pebble in the pond and having the ripple effect. But thank you for starting this. But can you share with to our audience?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So, please come and learn about the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. The website is cannaspecialists.org. Again, cannaspecialists.org. We have a lot of information that's sort of freely available. Obviously, if you join, you get a whole lot more in terms of things like some medical handbooks and a whole video series, as well as some more specific and more rigorous coursework available, including our signature 20-hour soup to nuts educational program that really is aimed at taking people from interested on to ready to practice this kind of medicine. We also do a lot in terms of public symposia and working on as an advocacy level at the federal level, aimed at developing tools so that we as clinicians can do a better job of taking care of our patients. So please come and join us. We welcome you. Oh, I shouldn't forget to mention mentoring. For a lot of folks, that's a really key benefit, where they get to sit and talk about cases and really get some experienced perspective on these things. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. I'll start with you, Dr. Aboudili. Thank you very much, as always, for being on. Dr. Maku and Dr. Jordan Tishler. This is John Malanka with the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and we'll see you on a next series discussion of casual conversations. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.